Betrayal. It's a word we usually reserve for enemies, strangers, people on the outside who've managed to worm their way close enough to hurt us. But sometimes, betrayal isn't about outsiders. Sometimes it's not the villain across the street or the rival at work. Sometimes it comes from within your own home, from the very people you've let into your life. People you've laughed with, broken bread with, trusted with your family. That's where my story begins. My betrayal didn't come from a stranger. It didn't come from an enemy. It came from my own brother-in-law. Now, let me set the scene for you. I wasn't living some kind of extraordinary life. I didn't have riches stacked up. I wasn't some celebrity on the front of magazines. My life was plain by most measures, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I had a wife I loved, a modest home, a job that paid the bills and gave me enough to keep food on the table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And in this world, steady is something worth holding on to. When I married my wife, I inherited a little more than vows and rings. I inherited her family too, and with them, I got her brother, my brother-in-law. Now, here's the thing about him. At first glance, he came across as charming. He was the kind of guy who could win a room if he wanted to. Quick with a joke, knew how to smile at the right moments, and had this easy confidence that made him seem harmless. If you didn't look too closely, you might think he was a guy who had it all together. But the truth is, masks are easy to wear, and his mask was covering up something rotten. In the beginning, we tried to get along. I wanted to believe we could be friends, even brothers in some way. We'd sit down for beers, watch the game, talk about the kind of nonsense men talk about to fill the silence, sports, politics, whatever came up. On the surface, it looked fine. But even in those early days, I caught glimpses of something else. He liked to brag, not about accomplishments or hard work, but about shortcuts. He loved telling stories of how he got away with things, schemes, lies, hustles. To him, life wasn't about honesty or effort. It was about winning. Always winning, no matter the cost. He didn't care if someone else paid the price, as long as he came out on top. I remember thinking, that's not the kind of man I want to be. But he wasn't my responsibility, so I shrugged it off. If he wanted to play games with his own life, so be it. What I didn't realize back then was that one day he'd try to play games with mine. As time passed, it became clearer that his life wasn't stable. He was always chasing money, always stuck in debt, always trying to dig himself out of holes he'd dug himself into. Relationships for him came and went in a blur, always fiery, always ending in ashes. And I think, deep down, he started to resent me. Maybe it was because I had something he didn't. I had stability. I had peace. And when a man who thrives on chaos sees another man living steadily, sometimes envy starts to boil. And envy, when it simmers too long, can turn into hate. It started small. At family gatherings, he'd make little comments, jokes, he called them, about my job, about my house, even about my marriage. Must be nice living that boring life. He'd chuckle. I'd laugh it off, trying not to make waves. But behind those words, I heard it. Contempt. He wasn't joking. He was mocking. Then came the favors. He'd ask for money. At first, small amounts. Just until Friday, he'd say, I'll pay you back next week. I believed him. Family helps family, right? Except the money never came back, and the next request was bigger. And then bigger again. Eventually, I had to put my foot down. I told him no. That's when the shift happened. His mask slipped. The bitterness showed through. He didn't like being denied. He didn't like that I wouldn't fund his bad decisions anymore. And I think, in that moment, he stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle. One night, after a few too many drinks, he pitched me one of his so-called opportunities. Said it was a way to make fast cash, serious money, as he put it. He leaned in like we were co-conspirators, like we were about to embark on something big together. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't a business deal. It was a scam. Something that could ruin lives, destroy people's savings, hurt families. I told him no. I told him I wasn't interested in cheating people out of their money. He didn't argue. He just leaned back, smiled thinly, and said, "You'll regret that." And my praise ong read, he-word. At the time, I brushed it off. Alcohol talking, I thought. Empty words. But looking back, I see now that was the moment he drew the line. That was the moment he decided I wasn't going to be his partner. I was going to be his problem. From then on, I started noticing things. The way he'd watch me a little too closely. The way he'd ask questions about my schedule, where I was going, what time I'd be back, who I was meeting. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe he was just being nosy. But there was something in his eyes when he asked. Something calculating. Something cold. And then came the day that would change my life forever. It was supposed to be ordinary. Just another afternoon. He called me up, said he needed help with something. "Nothing big," he said. "Just a hand with some work." I didn't think twice about it. He was family, and family helps family. He drove us out of town, farther than I expected, to a remote stretch of land. Out there, away from the roads, was a burn pit, a place where people dumped trash, scraps, things they didn't want anymore. It was quiet out there. Too quiet. No traffic, no birds, no people. Just the smell of smoke and the empty stretch of land. I stepped out of the truck, looked around, and felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. He made small talk, kept things casual, but his eyes told a different story. There was no warmth in them. No humor. Just cold intent. And then it happened. Without warning, he struck me. The first blow knocked the wind out of me. I stumbled, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What the hell?" I managed to gasp, but before I could steady myself, he shoved me hard. I went down, crashing into the dirt, sliding toward the pit. My body hit the ground hard, pain shooting through me. And that's when I smelled it. The acrid stench of burning waste, the crackle of flames, the heat radiating from the pit. In an instant, I understood. He wasn't trying to rough me up. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to erase me, to leave me in that pit like trash, let the fire consume me until there was nothing left but ashes. I lay there, stunned, gasping for air, while he stood over me. For a moment, I thought he'd finish the job, but he didn't. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps fading. He didn't check if I was dead. He didn't make sure. He just assumed the fire would do the rest. And maybe, for a moment, I wanted to let it. Maybe part of me thought it would be easier to close my eyes, let the smoke fill my lungs, let it all end there. But then I thought of my wife. I thought of my family. I thought of everything I still had to live for. And something inside me refused to give up. With every ounce of strength left in me, I dragged myself forward. My hands clawed at the dirt, my body screaming in pain with every movement. The heat seared my skin, the smoke burned my lungs, but I kept moving, inch by inch, until finally I pulled myself free of that pit. I collapsed on the ground, gasping, coughing, my vision swimming. My body was battered, burned, broken, but I was alive. And as I lay there, staring up at the sky, two thoughts burned in my mind. First, that my brother-in-law had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable, and second, that he had made a mistake, because I wasn't dead. And survival was enough. Because survival wasn't just about escaping death. Survival meant I now had the chance to make sure he paid for what he did. And in that moment, weak as I was, broken as I felt, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over, not even close. When I pulled myself out of that burn pit, coughing, bleeding, every muscle in my body screaming, I thought the worst was over. I thought survival itself was the victory. I couldn't have been more wrong. Surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because survival meant I had to live with the memory of what had just happened, and the knowledge that the man who tried to kill me was still out there, walking free, with no clue that I wasn't dead. And that realization hit me harder than the fall. I lay there for a long while, barely able to move, staring up at the sky, trying to gather the strength just to breathe. My lungs burned from the smoke, my throat felt raw, and every breath came in short, painful gasps. The skin on my arms and neck stung with burns. My clothes smelled of ash and fire. My head pounded, my body ached, but above all of that was a single crystal-clear thought. He left me for dead, and if he found out I wasn't, he'd try again. That thought jolted me into motion. Survival wasn't enough, I had to get away from there, and fast. I rolled onto my stomach, forcing my body to crawl. The ground was rough, each movement tore at me, but inch by inch I made my way toward the tree line. My ears still rang from the fall, but I could hear the faint crackle of fire behind me, the reminder of how close I'd come to being erased like garbage. When I reached the trees, I collapsed against the trunk of one, my vision spinning. The woods around me were quiet, eerily quiet. It struck me then how isolated this place was. Nobody would have heard me scream. Nobody would have stumbled across me by accident. He'd chosen this place carefully. He hadn't just lost his temper. This was planned. The betrayal cut deeper as I realized it. He had thought this through. He'd invited me here, knowing exactly what he was going to do. He'd looked me in the eye, made small talk, all while already deciding I wasn't going to leave alive. I swallowed hard, fighting down the wave of anger that surged up. Rage could come later. Right now, I needed to think clearly. Step 1. Survive the night. I needed water, shelter, some way to get out of those woods. My phone gone, lost in the scuffle or the fall. My truck? He had the keys. Even if I could find it, I couldn't drive, which meant walking, so I did. I staggered, limped, leaned on trees for balance. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but step by step, I pushed forward. Hours blurred together, my sense of time warped. The only things that mattered were my next breath, my next step. Somewhere along the way I laughed bitterly to myself. He really thought fire was going to be enough to finish me. The truth was, it almost had. But almost isn't the same as done. By the time I stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road, dawn was just beginning to break. The first rays of sunlight cut through the trees, warm on my skin, and for the first time since the attack, I felt a spark of hope. Not long after, I saw headlights. A pickup truck rattling down the road, driven by an old farmer on his way to town. When he saw me covered in ash, burned, bloodied, barely standing, he slammed the brakes so hard the tires squealed. "Good God, son, what the hell happened to you?" he shouted as he jumped out. I tried to answer, but my voice cracked. All I managed was, "Help." He didn't ask more questions. He just helped me into the truck, gave me water, and drove me straight to the hospital. The doctors swarmed me as soon as we arrived. They treated the burns, bandaged the wounds, checked for broken bones. Through it all, I kept thinking, do I tell them? Do I say what really happened? Because if I did, if word got out, my brother-in-law would know I was alive, and if he knew I was alive, he'd try again. So I kept my mouth shut. I told them I'd had an accident, fell near a fire pit, got hurt. They looked at me skeptically, but they didn't push. Maybe they chalked it up to trauma. Maybe they figured I wasn't ready to talk. Either way, they let it be. Lying there in that hospital bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying everything in my mind. His smirk, his shove, his footsteps walking away. He really thought he was rid of me, and the thought burned hotter than the flames ever could. I realized something then. Survival wasn't the end goal anymore. Survival was just the start. The real goal now was justice. Or maybe not justice, because justice implies fairness, law, some sense of order. No, what I wanted was revenge. But not the kind you see in movies where someone storms in guns blazing. No, That wasn't going to work here. My brother-in-law was reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He'd covered his tracks. If I went at him head-on without proof, without a plan, I'd look like the crazy one. He'd twist the story, make me seem unstable. And worst of all, he'd still be free. So I decided something in that hospital bed. If I was going to take him down, I had to be smarter. I had to be patient. I had to let him think he'd won. That's when the idea formed. He believed I was dead. Let him keep believing that. The thought gave me a strange sense of power. For the first time since the pit, I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. If he thought I was gone, he wouldn't be on guard. He wouldn't cover his tracks. He'd keep living his life recklessly, thinking the past was buried with me, and that would be his mistake. But to pull it off, I had to disappear. When the doctors discharged me, I didn't go home. I didn't call my wife. I didn't tell my friends. As far as they knew, I'd vanished. It tore me up inside to stay silent, to know my loved ones would be worried sick, maybe even mourning. But I couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until I was ready. I moved quietly, found a cheap motel under a different name, paid in cash. I wrapped my burns, healed in secret, and started making lists. Lists of what I knew about him. His habits, his debts, his weaknesses. Lists of people he dealt with, people he'd scammed, people who might want to talk if someone asked the right questions. Days turned into weeks, and every night I lay awake thinking of that moment in the pit. The heat, the smoke, the way he walked away without a second glance. That memory kept me sharp. It kept me angry. And anger, I learned, is fuel if you use it right. One night, as I sat at the small motel desk with papers spread around me, I whispered out loud, "This isn't over." And, for the first time since the attack, I believed it. Because survival had given me something more powerful than rage. It had given me time. Time to heal. Time to think. Time to plan. And when the time came, I would make sure he learned the one lesson he never saw coming. That the man he thought he left for dead was very much alive. And I was coming for him. After weeks of hiding in cheap motel rooms, bandages healing, and nights spent half awake with the memory of that pit still smoldering in my mind, I finally started moving from survival mode into strategy mode. Survival was immediate. Get out, get help, heal. Strategy was longer, colder, and far more dangerous. Strategy required patience. Strategy required building a case so airtight that when the moment came, he couldn't wiggle his way out with charm or lies. The first thing I did was inventory. Not physical objects, but moments, every conversation, every odd glance, every favor he'd asked. Memory became my evidence. I wrote down dates, locations, the tiny details he'd blurted when he felt safe. People underestimate how much people reveal when they're comfortable. He'd brag about victories, drop offhand comments about who owed him money, and slip into that arrogance where he assumed no one was watching. I kept a notebook and filled it with those slips. Then I started the slow work of mapping his world. He wasn't a high-powered criminal. He was a small-time operator with a penchant for schemes and a habit of burning bridges. That made him sloppy. Sloppy is exploitable. I began to list his debts, the places he frequented, the people who loaned him cash, the women he'd dated. I tracked who had reason to be angry with him. In a way, I was building a portrait of a man who survived on other people's blind spots. You learn quickly that people are mirrors of themselves. If he cheated, lied, or manipulated someone, that someone would have a story. And people who've been wronged are often willing to talk if you find the right way in. So I started digging into his past, not like a crazy ex-husband with a vendetta, but like a reporter looking for corroboration. I called numbers, asked casual questions, nudged conversations toward the topics I needed, and listened. I learned names, dates, patterns. I kept everything organized in folders, both digital and physical. Screenshots, voicemail clips, receipts, every small piece that assembled would form a clear picture. It was slow work. It was painstaking and dull at times, The kind of work that makes revenge feel clinical instead of cathartic. I missed my life, the boring parts, the normal parts. I missed my wife's laugh. I missed my routines. But what I had in place of those things was clarity. Every piece of evidence was a rung on a ladder I was climbing back out of the darkness with. One of the first breakthroughs came from a woman named Mara, someone I found by accident through a forum post. She'd once dated him briefly and had an earful of his nonsense. At first, she was defensive, who wouldn't be if a stranger called. But once I mentioned details only someone close to him would know, she opened up. She told me about loans he'd promised to pay back and never did, about small thefts from friends, about empty promises, not exactly criminal by headline standards, but patterns. Patterns that showed a man who had no problem using people as tools. Next, I found a vendor, a small landscaping supply store where he'd bought materials. A receipt tucked into the trash had his name. The receipt didn't prove he tried to kill me, of course, but it proved movement, presence, timelines. That's what I needed. Context. If I could show that, on the day he planned the pit, he'd been moving materials that matched the pit's contents, or that he'd been in places he shouldn't be, I could start to build causation instead of conjecture. I also began to play the social game differently. When you vanish, people assume things. Your absence becomes a vacuum filled by gossip. He used that vacuum. He told people I'd run off because of money problems, or that I'd started drinking again. People who wanted to believe the easy version of reality swallowed it. But I had a different tactic. I let the myth lie where it was, then fed subtle truths into the right ears friends he respected, co-workers of his, people whose opinions mattered in my circle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. The more I dug, the more I realized something important. He wasn't a lone wolf. He had accomplices of convenience, people who benefited from his scams, clients who turned a blind eye because they got something out of the arrangement. Making him fall meant nudging those people toward truth. People with skin in the game respond to risk. If they saw risk in him, they'd distance themselves. My job was to supply evidence that created that risk. There were nights when I felt like a villain in my own story. I'd sit in my motel room with a laptop's pale light reflecting off the window and wonder if this was the line I'd crossed into obsession. But two things kept me going. First, the memory of my son's face after he'd been saved. If the story you're fighting for is someone's safety, narrows things down fast. Second, the moral clarity of the mission. He had tried to end my life. That's not a gray area. That's black and white. As weeks folded into months, I decided it was time to test the waters. I couldn't just drop everything on a public forum and expect the truth to win cleanly. He had that charisma. He could gaslight like a pro. I needed leverage. So I set a trap that involved appearing foolish, intentional vulnerability, that invited him to make mistakes. I started showing up around places he frequented again, but different. Not as a man chased by rage, as a man with nothing to lose. I let him see me in situations that suggested I'd spiraled an embarrassing stumble into a bar, a fake text left visible that implied I'd been drinking. People love a comeback story and are quick to accept what looks like confirmation. He took the bait. He stopped being cautious around me. He let his guard down. And when he let his guard down, he lied. He told the same old stories about schemes and small-time deals with a looseness that made my catalog of evidence fit together like a jigsaw. I began secretly recording conversations, always with my phone safely in my pocket, always with legitimate reasons so I wouldn't look like a stalker. His voice would trip over phrases, slip into brags, reveal times and names. The recordings weren't glamorous. They were banal, the drudgery of a man too used to talking about himself and underestimating listeners. But they were gold. There were moments of close calls, too. Once he nearly found me. I'd been sitting at a diner, sipping coffee when he walked in. My heart did a strange thing, pit, lurch, a coldness behind my ribs. He didn't recognize me. He glanced at my face, then away. Maybe it was the bandages I'd hidden under sleeves, or the way I'd learned to move careful and ordinary. He sat elsewhere, ordered, and left. That moment tightened my resolve. He was arrogant enough to assume I was dead. That arrogance would be his undoing. With a growing pile of proof messages, receipts, recorded admissions, and tied-in witness accounts, I started the legal groundwork. I won't pretend this part was simple. Lawyers are expensive, and courts are landmarks of glacial patience. But I needed to understand how to translate my collection of evidence into something the system could act on. I met with a lawyer under the guise of asking general questions about personal protection orders. I didn't want to trigger anything risky. The lawyer explained the difference between criminal and civil remedies, how to present patterns of endangerment for a judge, how to arrange for temporary restraining orders. Most important, the lawyer emphasized precise documentation timelines, corroborated witness statements, physical evidence. On the quieter side, I was also doing the human work. I'd been away from my son and wife long enough that the ache inside me threatened to become a roar. I had to keep my distance for the plan, but I also needed my reason to stay human. I found ways to watch from afar, distant calls, messages that reassured without revealing. I sent notes signed with the initials only my wife would recognize. I paid for house repairs anonymously when something broke. I didn't want to be a ghost, but I needed to be one for as long as the plan required. It wasn't all strategy and ledger work. The quiet moments returned. Too, the kind that almost made me forget why I'd started. Sometimes I'd go into a cheap motel restroom, look at myself in the mirror, and let myself grieve. Let the rage go for a few minutes and feel the loss. That mattered. Revenge without humanity becomes empty. I wanted to be careful, revenge tempered with restraint, because there's a difference between justice and becoming the thing you hated. The plan had another crucial component: exposure. Not exposure in some theatrical, viral way, but in a controlled, professional manner. People like him rely on reputation more than truth. He cultivated an image. The image had to fall apart in places that mattered: workplaces, landlords, lenders, and mutual friends. I started sending small, carefully worded notes to people he'd worked with, framed as concerns rather than accusations. Have you noticed delays in payments? Have you received unusual messages? The goal wasn't to start a witch hunt. It was to check if more people had been harmed and to create a network of corroboration. It worked. Slowly, the threads began to pull. One woman confirmed that he'd promised payment for services she never received. A landlord called back, confirming overdue rent. A company mentioned suspicious expense claims. Each yes added weight. It didn't feel like triumph yet. It felt like the steady accumulation of truth. As the dossier grew, so did my confidence. I wasn't just some wounded man clawing at shadows. I was a man with evidence, allies, and a strategy. The next phase was riskier, turning all this into leverage that would force him into a position where he'd either change the narrative or be stripped of the armor he used to hide behind. The beauty of patience is that it gives you choice. I had options now. I could go to the police with my evidence, risk a slow criminal process and expose myself prematurely, or I could stage a move that would cripple him socially and legally. I chose a hybrid. Use the law where it moved swiftly, protective orders, use social credibility to isolate him, and keep a final reveal for the moment when his world would crumble fastest. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. I'd learned from the pit that haste breeds mistakes. He'd already assumed he'd won. That arrogance was my ally. I had to make sure I didn't squander it. So I kept working, filling the margins, creating the case that would one day end him. When people ask whether revenge made me feel better, the answer is complicated. There are days when I felt vindicated, a small victory when a witness agreed to sign a statement, or when a creditor finally confirmed non-payment. There were nights when the ache in my chest eased a fraction, and I could almost breathe without the memory choking me. But there were also nights filled with guilt for the person I was becoming in the pursuit of this. Still, one truth anchored me. He had chosen to burn me. Letting him walk free because I felt sorry for the man who left my body for ash. That wasn't an option. Not if I wanted to sleep at night. Not if I wanted my son to live a life not shadowed by what could have been. So I kept going. Small steps, patient moves, quietly assembling the means to turn his arrogance into a trap. And all the while, I kept one final, crucial rule. Never let him know I was watching. Never let him see the file. Never let him sense the net tightening. Because men like him, reckless, arrogant, and cruel, thrive on being underestimated. He had underestimated me once. He wouldn't do it again, not if I could help it. The pieces were coming together. The next moves would be louder. The fall would be public. But for now, the work was in the quiet accumulation proof, patience, and preparation. That was where the real power lived. By the time I decided it was time to move from slow accumulation of evidence into a more public phase, the binder on the motel desk had become a kind of ugly Bible. Screenshots, receipts, transcribed conversations, witness names, timelines neat, cold, and thorough. It felt strange to take satisfaction in that order, but clarity is a kind of comfort when your bones have been singed. I knew exactly what his day looked like during the weeks around the pit. I knew who had loaned him money and who he'd stiffed. I knew the women he'd courted and discarded. The man who'd assumed he'd disposed of me had left behind plenty of breadcrumbs. The first move was surgical and small. A single, discreet conversation with someone who mattered, someone in his professional orbit whose opinion others respected. Reputation is a fragile thing. For many, reputation is currency. He'd traded on a thin veneer of reliability. If that veneer cracked, he'd lose leverage. So I found a person who'd worked with him on a project, a middle manager who'd already been burned by his half-promises. I walked into the cafe on a rainy Tuesday, ordered a coffee, and slid a folded note under his napkin. No accusations, just a question and a fact. Did X miss payments? Have you noticed odd behavior? In the way of small communities, the question ricocheted. The manager called me later quiet, almost relieved, and told me he'd begun checking ledgers. That tiny pebble had started an avalanche. Once one person starts to connect what they already suspected, the social equation changes. Suddenly, people who had pretended not to notice found reasons to distance themselves. Creditors grew impatient. Friends who had once enabled his lifestyle began to murmur. That isolation was crucial. Frightened men lash out. Isolated men make mistakes. My job was to encourage the mistakes without appearing to be the engineer of them. At the same time, the legal thread was woven tighter. I started working more aggressively with the lawyer I'd consulted earlier. We filed for a temporary protective order, low profile at first, a legal shell that would later be part of the wall keeping him away from my family. A lawyer's job is translation, turning scattered human experience into the language of proof the court understands. My notes became affidavits, my recordings were cataloged and time-stamped, and slowly, the chaotic mess of the attack was converted into a structured narrative a judge could read without pity or drama, a pattern of dangerous behavior resulting in a violent, premeditated attempt on my life. There was an odd moral calculus in this phase. I was careful to separate moral victory from strategic necessity. My moves weren't about spectacle. I didn't want the town gossip to devour the story and reduce it to fodder for cheap sympathies and cheap indignation. I wanted an irreversible removal of his ability to harm. Courts give you that in a way rumor never will. But courts act slowly. Social isolation moves faster, one after another. The small dominoes started to fall. A landlord called me to confirm that he'd left rent unpaid for months. A small business owner reluctantly admitted the man had taken supplies and never paid. A woman who had been his girlfriend for a year shed light on manipulations I'd only suspected. Each new corroboration strengthened the case and widened the circle of people who'd witnessed his true face. And because I kept invisible, because I let him continue thinking I'd vanished, his arrogance grew. He began to act with less restraint. He'd post boastful things online, trending between false modesty and the kind of petty displays that say more than they intend. He even flirted dangerously with old habits, late nights, secretive meetings, people he thought were beneath consequence. This arrogance was a gift. Men who believe themselves untouchable reveal their patterns at scale. Not everything worked the way I wanted. There were tense nights when I feared exposure, when someone might leap to conclusion that I was the troublemaker, when whispers would reach my wife. That would have been devastating. But those moments passed. My wife was smarter than either of us gave her credit for. She began to ask her own questions. A receipt here, an odd late-night text there. Pieces clicked in her mind. When she confronted him for the first time, he laughed it off. Charm is a practiced skill in manipulators. But charm fractures under sustained scrutiny. My wife's annoyance became curiosity, and curiosity became investigation. That shift was crucial once she began to see clearly she allied with the truth. Family, by then, had a choice to make, and she chose our son. One of the more delicate maneuvers was to engage the other women, quietly, those he'd used and thrown away. Many of them were angry, ashamed, frightened to speak. Abusive men cultivate shame in their victims because ashamed people often stay quiet. I reached out with empathy and patience. Sometimes a single question, did he ever do XYZ, was enough to make someone exhale and say, yes. Those confirmations weren't dramatic, they were critical. A chorus of small voices builds a case louder than any single shout. Meanwhile, I kept my son at the center of everything I did. Protecting him wasn't merely a legal argument, it was the moral backbone of my case. I documented how the boy's behavior changed, nightly routines disrupted, how the nightmares persisted when certain words or sounds were triggered. I assembled therapy notes, pediatrician observations, facts that linked the man's actions to real, measurable harm. A judge doesn't rule on rage, they rule on risk, and risk related to a child carries weight. The more clinical and less emotional I made the documentation, the better it worked in court. When the protective order was finally granted, it felt less like triumph and more like a temporary exhale. The judge looked at the papers, listened to the testimony, careful, courteous, and decided that the risk of harm was high enough to warrant immediate distance. The court's language was clinical. Temporary restraining order, supervised visitation, no contact. But in practical terms, it meant the man couldn't legally approach our home or our child. For the first time since that night in the pit, there was a legal barrier between him and my family. It wasn't perfect, but it was a lifeline. If you think he accepted the decision gracefully, you don't know him. Manipulators don't go quietly. He tried to spin the story, painting himself as the aggrieved party, claiming I'd staged an incident, accused him falsely, that the family was being divided by a bitter ex. He used the only weapon he had left, public pity and a rehearsed charm. Some people bought it, some turned away. That was painful but expected. The important thing was that the people who mattered, those with documented evidence and an understanding of the timeline, saw through it. He also tried small acts of spite, anonymously delivered letters to the house, messages to our phones via friends, the kind of small harassment that's more nuisance than threat. For a while, I let these things slide into the folder marked nuisance. The law was catching up. Those actions would be noted and would later feed into a pattern of harassment. Every time he lashed out, he added to the case I'd quietly been compiling. One of the most satisfying moments wasn't a legal victory at all, but the slow collapse of his social circle. People who had once laughed off his charm now turned the other way when he entered a room. Invitations dried up. Employment opportunities evaporated as word ran along the right channels. He was losing the very illusions he relied upon. Men, like him, live on borrowed trust. Once that's gone, they're exposed skeletons. But there's a dangerous lull in watching someone you hate unravel. You can start to think maybe the deed is done, that the job is finished. The truth is, it never ends cleanly. You can file orders, shred reputations, and create distance, but the emotional residue lingers. My son was safer. Yes, he slept more, and the edges on his nightmares softened. But trauma isn't a newspaper you fold up and throw away, it's a scar you carry. So while I celebrated the legal victories quietly, I stayed wary. There was always the chance of escalation when the man felt cornered. Cornered men are unpredictable. When their options narrow, they sometimes lash out in ways you don't expect. That's why the protective order came with a checklist. Document every contact, call the police immediately, preserve every message. We followed the checklist religiously. In one instance, when he tried to contact our neighbor through a mutual friend, we immediately documented it and filed an addendum. Little by little, the legal fence became fortified. There were also moments of personal cost. The hiding, the secrecy, the coldness necessary to keep the plan intact, all of it took a toll on intimacy with my wife. Relationships strain under secrecy. Even though she was aligning with the evidence, trust takes time to rebuild. There were nights we sat across from one another, the TV on but nothing watching, both of us haunted by different memories. I learned to be patient. I learned to accept that legal victories don't equal emotional closure, and then came the day that made everything feel undeniably real. One of the women he'd wronged, a quiet, resolve-steeled person named Mara, agreed to testify. She had seen his pattern and, crucially, had records that directly contradicted his public claims. When she sat down to speak with our lawyer and then later with investigators, the air shifted. Her testimony tied threads together in ways a single voice seldom can. She didn't shout. She presented facts, receipts, dates. That's all it took. Facts. When the prosecution took another look at the file, things accelerated. I won't pretend the criminal process was instantaneous or drama-free. It isn't. But the combination of social isolation, civil protective measures, and multiple corroborating testimonies forced law enforcement to re-engage. Arrest warrants were discussed. Investigations deepened. The man who had once assumed he could walk away from his worst deed now faced the cumulative weight of a community's evidence. We weren't naive enough to think a court would erase the past. Courts order consequences. They don't guarantee healing. But when the state began to move, when the sheriff's deputies made inquiries, something shifted in the man. Panic replaced arrogance. He made mistakes. He reached out to people he shouldn't have. He tried to bribe, to charm, to coerce. Each attempt was another piece of evidence and another reason for those around him to step back. Through it all, my focus never wavered from the child. He was the reason this slow, often ugly choreography was undertaken. Watching him play without flinching, seeing his shoulders relax, seeing him draw a tree without dark shadows. Those were the moments I held on to when the legal machine moved at its torturous pace. The satisfaction in seeing him smile, unguarded, was a truer revenge than any ruin I could inflict. And yet, even with courtrooms and restraining orders and testimonies, there was always the knowledge that people are complicated and systems imperfect. I had taken him down in the most effective ways I could, but the battle didn't end with his arrest or his job loss. The battle ended slowly, in the day-to-day rebuilding of trust, in bedtime rituals, in therapy appointments, in the quiet creation of new memories that would, one day, outnumber the old. Looking back on that phase now, it feels like a long series of small, intentional strikes, each one designed to nibble away the man's stability until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't cinematic. It was tedious, precise, and relentless. But it worked. He was losing his footing. The town that had once included him in barbecues and birthdays had begun to close its doors. His phone calls went unanswered. His ego, once inflated by petty victories, was punctured. And though this didn't erase the burn scars on my skin or the nights I'd spent scraping dirt from cuts, it did something else. It created space. Space for my son to heal. Space for my wife to choose safety over illusion. Space for us to begin slowly and imperfectly to rebuild. There's a point in every revenge story where the objective reality catches up with the inner world. The man you hate might be crumbling on paper, but inside you, healing isn't automatic. That's the next part of the battle. And in the chapters that follow, the work shifts from tearing down to building up, from evidence to empathy, from blame to repair. But in that moment, when the legal order was in place and his social world was fraying, I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. The man who once left me for dead had been forced into a place where he could no longer pretend. The mask slipped. The truth stood naked. And, for the first time since the pit, I slept a little easier, knowing my son would wake in the morning safe. By the time the first legal walls closed in around him, I thought maybe I'd reached the turning point in this nightmare. The restraining order was in place, testimonies were stacking up, and slowly but surely, his social circle was beginning to collapse. It felt like momentum was on my side. But real life isn't neat. Just because the law had finally started to recognize the danger didn't mean the danger had disappeared. My brother-in-law still believed he could maneuver his way out of this. He always had a talent for illusions, and in his mind, if he could just twist the story the right way, he could claw back the life he thought he was losing. That was the next battle I faced. Not just against him, but against the stories he told. It started quietly. People I'd once considered friends, or at least neutral, began reaching out, not to offer support but to ask questions. They'd heard his spin. He painted me as unstable, claimed the burn pit was some kind of accident I had exaggerated, and even suggested I had injured myself and concocted the story to destroy him. To people who wanted an easy explanation, that version sounded less horrifying than the truth. And so they asked me, with cautious voices, whether any of it was real. My instinct was to shout. I wanted to drop every receipt, every recording, every scrap of proof on the table, and drown out his lies. But I had been warned. Don't fight battles in gossip. Fight them in court. Gossip doesn't hand you custody of your child. Gossip doesn't keep dangerous men away from your family. Gossip only feeds fire. So I bit back the anger, swallowed the words I wanted to scream, and simply said, "The truth is coming out. You'll see." Then I walked away. That was harder than it sounds, but every time I stayed silent, I imagined my son's face that kept me steady. Meanwhile, my wife was beginning her own quiet awakening. For months she had been torn, caught between loyalty to her brother and the unease that something wasn't right. When she first confronted him about the missing money and strange phone calls, he did what he always did, turned on the charm. He spun excuses, played the victim, tried to make her feel guilty for even questioning him. For a while, it worked. But charm eventually wears thin, especially when the inconsistencies keep piling up. She started noticing the things she once ignored. Receipts that didn't match his stories, sudden bursts of cash with no explanation. Late-night calls he wouldn't answer in front of her. Every excuse he gave her made less sense than the last. The turning point came late one night when she called me, her voice trembling. She whispered, "I think I finally believe you." That moment shifted the weight of everything. For the first time, I wasn't carrying it alone. She began to keep her own records, documenting the texts and voicemails he left her, collecting the receipts he forgot to hide. Each detail was another nail in his coffin. It wasn't easy for her. Watching your own sibling unravel is like watching your childhood home collapse before your eyes. But she chose safety. She chose our son. That choice gave me a strength I hadn't felt in months. My son, though, carried the heaviest burden of all. Children don't always have the words for trauma. They show it in small ways. He started crawling into bed at night, trembling without knowing why. Sometimes he'd line up his toys in rigid patterns, repeating the same phrases softly, like chants. The pediatrician called it regression, a common response in children who faced fear they can't process. But I knew it was his way of carrying shadows too heavy for him. We got him into therapy, gentle sessions where he could draw, talk, or just sit silently if that was what he needed. Slowly, he began to ease. The nightmares became less frequent. The tension in his shoulders softened. Every improvement reminded me why I was fighting this battle. While our son worked through his silence, my brother-in-law tried to stage a comeback. He showed up at community events, looking sharp, smiling too wide, overcompensating with forced charm. He pitched new projects, talked loudly about forgiveness, wrote online about moving past toxic people. He painted himself as the victim, a man unfairly maligned by lies. Some people bought it at first. They wanted to believe in redemption. They wanted to cling to the easier story. But his behavior was too inconsistent. For every polished post, there was a drunken rant. For every new opportunity he bragged about, there was an unpaid bill. The cracks began to show, and I helped those cracks widen. Quietly, carefully. A document slipped into the right hands. A screenshot passed at the right time. A whisper to someone who mattered. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just enough to remind people of who he really was. His attempt at reinvention unraveled as quickly as it had begun. When charm failed, he switched to intimidation. Letters began arriving, not directly because of the restraining order, but passed through mutual acquaintances. They were vague, but heavy with menace. Tell him I know where he is. This isn't over. Some looked like drunken scrawls, others were typed neatly as if to look official. Each one went straight into the evidence file. The police treated them as minor at first, but patterns matter. One letter can be brushed aside. 10 letters start to look like stalking. Through it all, I stuck to routines. Therapy sessions for my son, regular check-ins with my lawyer, notes updated every night. I learned something during those weeks. Revenge isn't always about dramatic strikes. Sometimes it's about patience. Sometimes it's about letting a man dig his own grave, one reckless act at a time. And in the middle of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. One night, after putting our son to bed, my wife sat beside me on the couch and handed me a photo album. Inside were pictures of us from years before birthdays, camping trips, lazy Sunday mornings. She pointed to one picture of us sitting at a picnic table, laughing with our son. "I want this back," she said quietly. For months I'd been consumed by strategy, anger, evidence. That album reminded me of the real goal. Not the satisfaction of watching him crumble, but the restoration of what he had tried to steal, a safe, ordinary life. That reminder became my anchor when the nights stretched too long. By then, the legal process was moving toward real consequences. Investigators were looking deeper. The courts were preparing for hearings, and the walls were slowly closing in. But I knew this story wasn't finished. He had tried charm, he had tried intimidation, and none of it had worked. The next move was coming, and I had to be ready for it. The closer we moved toward the hearings, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. It was like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the story would break. My brother-in-law had always been good at theatrics, but even his tricks were beginning to wear thin. Still, a man like him doesn't go down quietly. He was cornered, and cornered men don't always lash out in predictable ways. They scheme, they gamble. They reach for anything left within arm's length. By that point, I had grown used to the rhythm of waiting. Days spent gathering records, nights spent writing notes, weekends filled with therapy appointments for my son. It was tedious, but grounding. Revenge had stopped feeling like fire in my veins. It had become a cold, steady kind of determination. Every letter he sent, every violation he attempted, went into the growing stack of evidence. My lawyer called it building a wall, brick by brick. To me, it felt more like weaving a net, tightening it slowly until he had nowhere to move. But one evening, just as I thought things were stabilizing, I got word that rattled me. A friend called to say he'd seen my brother-in-law in a nearby bar, bragging loudly that the court had nothing on him. He laughed that I was a coward, claimed I was hiding because I had no proof, and boasted that soon he'd be back around my family, whether I liked it or not. The words themselves didn't scare me. Boasting was his nature, but the confidence behind them did. It meant he was planning something. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing the pit again, the smell of smoke, the sound of footsteps walking away. It played like a loop in my head until I had to get up, pace the room, and remind myself that I wasn't the same man anymore. Back then, I had been blindsided. Now I was prepared. And it turned out I was right to stay alert. A week later, one of the women who had agreed to testify against him called me in tears. She said he had shown up at her work, leaning against the counter like nothing was wrong, and whispered that if she opened her mouth in court, bad things would happen. She tried to brush it off, but the threat stuck to her like smoke. She asked me what she should do. I told her the only thing I could. Document it. Write down the time, the place, the exact words, and give it to the lawyer. When my lawyer received her statement, his tone shifted. Until then, he had spoken in calm, measured terms, but this time there was an edge in his voice. "This isn't just harassment anymore," he said. "This is witness intimidation. Judges don't take kindly to that." That was the turning point. Up until then, I had been the main witness to his cruelty. Now others were stepping forward, their voices weaving together with mine. He wasn't just fighting me anymore. He was fighting a chorus of people who had suffered under his lies, and the more he tried to silence them, the louder they became. Meanwhile, my son continued to heal, slowly but noticeably. His drawings grew brighter. He slept longer without interruptions. He even laughed more freely, a sound that filled the house like sunlight after a storm. Every time I heard it, I felt the anger in me cool just a little more. It reminded me that the fight wasn't only about punishing a man, it was about protecting a child's ability to grow up without fear. But healing doesn't erase the scars. My wife and I had long conversations late at night, sitting across from one another with mugs of tea that went cold between us. She admitted the guilt she felt, the shame of not seeing her brother's darkness sooner. I admitted the rage that still woke me in the middle of the night, fists clenched, heart racing. We both understood that survival wasn't the end of the road. Survival was just the first chapter. The harder work was rebuilding trust, both between us and within ourselves. The legal process, slow as it was, kept grinding forward. Depositions were scheduled, witnesses were interviewed, and every time my brother-in-law tried to slip around the edges through intimidation, through false charm, through manipulation, the system caught another piece of him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, as I sat in my lawyer's office going over transcripts, I asked him if he thought we would win. He leaned back, tapped his pen against the desk, and said, "Winning looks different in cases like this. It's not about one dramatic verdict. It's about safety. It's about building enough layers of protection that he can't hurt you again. And from where I'm sitting, you're getting there." That answer stayed with me. Revenge had once burned in me like a desire to see him suffer, to feel the same fear he'd forced on me. But as the months passed, I realized the true victory was quieter. It was in the simple acts of living without him, taking my son to school, cooking dinner with my wife, falling asleep without checking the locks 3 times. That was the kind of revenge he could never undo. Still, I wasn't naive. Cornered men can be dangerous, and his pride was still bruised. I knew there was a chance he would lash out again before the final gavel fell. But this time I wasn't the unsuspecting man he shoved into a pit. I was watching. I was documenting. And most of all, I wasn't alone anymore. The net was tightening. His world was shrinking. And even though the scars on my skin would never fully fade, I had begun to realize something important. The scars weren't just reminders of pain, they were reminders of survival. Proof that he had tried to erase me, and failed. The fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time since that night, I believed the ending was no longer in his hands. It was in mine. The weeks leading up to the court hearings felt like walking across a rope bridge in the dark. Every step forward creaked under my weight, and I never knew which plank might snap. On paper, things were moving in my favor, witnesses lined up, evidence cataloged, the protective order still intact, but in real life, there was no sense of security. Every time I walked down the street, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, I braced myself for bad news. Living in constant anticipation of the next move became its own kind of prison. Still, I kept moving. I knew that patience was my sharpest weapon. He thrived on chaos, on making people react to his games. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I poured my energy into strengthening the case, brick by brick. My lawyer kept reminding me that patterns are everything. A single mistake can be explained away, but a pattern speaks for itself. So that became my focus. Patterns. I organized the timeline of every violation, every threat, every half-baked attempt he made to twist the narrative in his favor. One night, while flipping through the files, I realized something that made my stomach turn. The dates of his accidental visits near my house matched perfectly with the days when I'd seen unfamiliar cars idling down the street. I had written them off as coincidence at the time, but seeing them lined up on paper erased any doubt. He had been circling us like a wolf testing a fence. The protective order wasn't keeping him away, it was only slowing him down. That knowledge hardened my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, I was fighting to keep him from trying again. Meanwhile, the social walls continued to crumble around him. Employers no longer returned his calls. Friends who once enabled his behavior now avoided him in public. Even family members started to distance themselves. But instead of facing the truth, he doubled down. He told anyone who would listen that I was orchestrating a smear campaign, that I had brainwashed my wife, that I had somehow turned the entire community against him. It was almost pathetic, watching him flail. But pathetic doesn't mean harmless. Pathetic men can still be dangerous when pride and desperation drive them. One of the most chilling moments came during a routine grocery run. I was standing in line, my son tugging at my sleeve, when I felt the familiar prickle of eyes on me. I glanced over and saw him across the store, half hidden near the end of an aisle. He didn't approach. He didn't say a word. He just watched. His stare wasn't filled with rage this time. It was emptier, colder, as if he were already imagining the next move. My instinct was to storm over, to confront him in front of everyone. But I remembered the plan. I took out my phone, snapped a photo, and added it to the file. Another violation. Another brick in the wall. That night, my wife and I sat together in silence, the photo glowing on my phone screen between us. Finally, she said, "How much longer can this go on?" I didn't have an answer, but I promised her something I knew I could keep. "As long as it takes, we'll see this through." The next step in my plan was to widen the circle of accountability. It wasn't enough to have witnesses and evidence in a folder. I needed more eyes on him, more people invested in the outcome. So I began reaching out quietly, carefully to others who had crossed paths with him. Old employers, landlords, business partners. Some hung up on me immediately. Others listened, skeptical at first, then slowly admitted they too had stories of being cheated, manipulated, or threatened. I documented it all. What emerged wasn't just my story of betrayal and survival. It was a collective story of a man who had left a trail of wreckage behind him for years. And then came a breakthrough I hadn't expected. A woman contacted me after hearing whispers of the case. She said she had been too afraid to speak before, but she had once overheard him bragging to a friend about getting rid of a problem by the burn pit. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time, but when she heard about my story, the pieces clicked. Her testimony wasn't just useful, it was explosive. For the first time, there was someone else who could place his words alongside my experience. My lawyer's reaction was immediate. "This is it," he said, eyes narrowing as he flipped through her statement. "This is the kind of corroboration that shifts everything. Even with the progress, doubt never left me. Nights were the hardest. Sometimes I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, certain that I heard footsteps outside. I'd grab the flashlight, check every lock, and still lie awake staring at the ceiling. Healing isn't linear. One day I felt strong, the next I felt like I was back in the pit again. But I forced myself to keep moving, because stopping meant giving him ground. One evening, after another long day of paperwork and strategy meetings, my wife handed me a cup of tea and said, "You're different now. You're quieter, harder." I didn't know if it was a compliment or a warning, but I understood what she meant. Revenge changes you. Survival changes you. I wasn't the same man who had gone out for a casual afternoon and been shoved into fire. I was sharper now, colder in some ways. But I reminded myself that coldness can be useful. It keeps you focused. It keeps you alive. By the time the court date drew near, the case against him was no longer a shaky story of one man's word against another. It was a mosaic of evidence, voices, and patterns that painted a clear picture of who he really was. And he knew it. You could see it in the way he moved, jittery and defensive, trying to puff himself up in public but shrinking the moment he was challenged. I realized then that the most dangerous weapon I had wasn't the recordings or the receipts or even the testimonies. It was the truth itself. Truth, once revealed, doesn't go back into the shadows, and he had spent his entire life hiding from it. The day was coming when he would have to face that truth. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about revenge anymore. It would be about reclaiming everything he had tried to take from me, my family, my safety, my peace. The rope bridge was swaying, the planks were groaning, but I could see the other side. And for the first time since the night of the pit, I believed I might actually make it there. The day the hearings finally arrived, the sky was overcast, heavy with the kind of clouds that look like they're ready to split open. It fit the mood perfectly. I remember waking up before dawn, staring at the ceiling in the half-dark, and feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. This was the culmination of everything I had endured. The pit, the scars, the whispers, the threats. I had carried all of it to this point, and now the truth was about to be spoken aloud in a place where lies could finally be cornered. Walking into the courthouse, I felt the world narrow down to each step. My son was at home with a sitter, too young to understand but old enough to feel the tension in the air. My wife walked beside me, her jaw tight, her hand gripping mine like an anchor. When we stepped into the lobby, I saw him across the room. My brother-in-law looked thinner, his face drawn, but the arrogance was still there in the way he stood shoulders back, chin high, as if the world still owed him something. He caught my eye and smirked. That smirk sent a shiver down my spine, but it also lit a fire in me, because this time I wasn't walking into his trap. This time he was walking into mine. The proceedings began with formality introductions, statements, the kind of bureaucratic language that can lull you to sleep if you're not personally invested. But I was invested. Every word spoken carried the weight of my survival. When my lawyer began presenting the timeline, I watched the judge's eyes. He wasn't distracted. He was listening carefully. That gave me hope. Then came the testimonies. One by one, people stepped forward. The woman who had overheard him bragging about getting rid of a problem near the burn pit. The co-workers he had threatened when they asked questions. The witnesses he had tried to intimidate with late-night visits and whispered warnings. Each voice added a new thread to the web, weaving tighter and tighter around him. I expected him to sit in silence, but he couldn't help himself. Every time someone testified, he muttered under his breath, shook his head, rolled his eyes. At one point, he even laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made the whole courtroom turn. The judge warned him to control himself, but the damage was already done. Everyone could see what I had been saying all along. This was a man who thrived on manipulation, who couldn't stand losing control. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and felt my knees tremble for a moment. I gripped the edge of the podium until the shaking stopped. Then I told my story not in a dramatic way, not with exaggerated words, but simply, plainly. I described the pit, the smoke, the sound of footsteps walking away. I described the nights of watching over my son, the fear of seeing strange cars outside, the letters passed through third parties with threats scribbled across them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just laid the truth out piece by piece, like bricks in a wall. When I finished, there was a silence in the room that felt heavier than words. I glanced at the jury, and I saw it in their faces. They believed me. His lawyer tried to tear me down. He suggested I was exaggerating, that my scars weren't proof of intent, that I was driven by bitterness. But each question he asked only gave me another chance to clarify, to reinforce the facts. The truth doesn't flinch when it's poked. It stands. and by the time his lawyer sat down, I could feel the balance shifting. Then it was his turn. He swaggered up, trying to turn on the same charm that had once fooled so many. He spoke about being misunderstood, about how the world had turned against him. He painted himself as the victim of a vindictive brother-in-law who couldn't let go of the past. But the cracks showed. His voice wavered when he was pressed for specifics. He couldn't explain the money inconsistencies, the texts, the late-night visits. He contradicted himself more than once. The smirk slipped, replaced by frustration, then by anger. The judge noticed. The jury noticed. Everyone noticed. By the end of the day, it was clear that his story was unraveling. The net had closed in around him, tighter than even I had dared to hope. When the gavel came down to adjourn until the following session, I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes wet but fierce. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, microphones in hand. I kept walking. I didn't need to perform for them. The real performance had already happened inside. What mattered now was the outcome, not the spotlight. That night, sitting at home, I watched my son play on the floor with his blocks, humming softly to himself. For the first time in years, I felt a cautious kind of peace settle in my chest. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the one trapped, struggling against the walls he had built for himself. And as I tucked my son into bed, kissed his forehead, and turned off the light, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't the smirk I'd seen on my brother-in-law's face. Revenge was this moment, quiet, safe, ordinary. The kind of life he had tried to take from me, restored piece by piece. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. But tonight, in the silence of a house that finally felt like a home again, I allowed myself to believe that justice was not just possible, but inevitable. The second day in court carried a different energy. The first day had been about laying foundations, telling the story, giving everyone a sense of the battlefield. The second day was about details, the kind of details that can either crumble a defense or reinforce it. My lawyer walked me through what to expect, but nothing could have prepared me for the tension of watching years of evidence distilled into hours of testimony. When the proceedings resumed, his lawyer tried one last desperate tactic: character witnesses. He had scraped together a few people willing to vouch for him, to say he was misunderstood, to swear that he had never been capable of the things I accused him of. But the effort backfired. Each person who spoke on his behalf was cross-examined, and under pressure, their stories cracked. One man admitted he hadn't actually seen him in years. Another confessed that he had been pressured into speaking up. By the time the third witness stumbled through contradictory statements, the jury's faces told the story. His defense wasn't building credibility, it was dissolving in real time. Then, the financial records were presented. This was something my wife and I had worked quietly on for months, gathering the evidence of his double dealings, the lies about income, the unexplained expenses. Watching the papers stack up on the judge's bench felt like watching bricks fall into place on a wall. Each receipt, each bank statement, painted the picture of a man who had been living far outside the truth. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his lawyer, whispering furiously. The smirk was gone now, replaced by the stiff posture of someone realizing his stories no longer held weight. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier as the hours dragged on. My testimony had been powerful, but this evidence was irrefutable. It wasn't just my word anymore. It was numbers, facts, dates. You can argue against emotion. You can't argue against math. During a recess, I stepped outside into the crisp air and leaned against the wall of the courthouse. My wife stood beside me, silent for a long time before finally saying, "I think this is it. I think he's done." Her voice carried a mix of relief and disbelief, like she wanted to trust the moment but couldn't quite let go of the fear. I understood. Fear doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, like smoke after a fire. Back inside, the final blow came from the testimony of the woman who had once overheard him bragging about the burn pit. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, and described the night she'd heard him laughing about getting rid of a problem. You could feel the courtroom tighten with every word she spoke. His lawyer objected, tried to dismiss it as hearsay, but the judge allowed it, and in that moment, his carefully constructed mask shattered completely. He slammed his hand on the table, muttered curses, and had to be warned again to control himself. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. Everyone saw the man I had known all along, the one who couldn't hide his contempt, his rage, his belief that he was untouchable. By the end of the day, there was no mistaking the direction things were heading. The net had closed fully. His reputation, once so carefully managed, lay in pieces on the floor of that courtroom. He had tried to rebuild himself in the community, but here, in front of people who mattered, the truth was undeniable. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time, I felt the full weight of relief beginning to settle. It was almost too much to process. For years, I had lived in survival mode, always waiting for the next blow, always guarding against the shadows. Now, standing on the edge of justice, I realized how much of myself I had lost along the way. Anger had kept me alive. Patience had kept me steady. But what would come after? Who was I without the fight? I found myself watching my son again, the way he built towers with his blocks, the way he laughed when they toppled over. That laughter became the answer. I wasn't just surviving for me. I was surviving for him, for the chance to give him a life untouched by the poison of his uncle's influence. And maybe, in rebuilding for him, I could rebuild for myself too. The third and final day was scheduled to deliver the outcome. As I sat at the kitchen table with my wife that evening, the quiet stretched between us. Finally, she reached across, placed her hand on mine, and whispered, "Tomorrow, we get our lives back." I wanted to believe her. And deep down, I did. Because after everything, the pit, the scars, the lies, the intimidation, we had finally dragged the truth into the light. And once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. Tomorrow, the gavel would fall, and when it did, it wouldn't just mark the end of his games. It would mark the beginning of something new for us. The morning of the final day arrived with a strange stillness. I woke before the alarm, sunlight barely filtering through the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before moving. My wife stirred beside me, opened her eyes, and for once there wasn't tension in her face. Just quiet determination. We didn't need to say much. We both knew what this day meant. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. You could feel it pressing down on everyone in the room, like the air before a thunderstorm. The judge entered, papers shuffled, and for a moment I thought my heart might break through my chest. I glanced across the aisle at him, my brother-in-law, the man who had left me for dead. He looked worn down, almost gaunt, but the fire of defiance was still there in his eyes. He believed right until the end that somehow, some way, he could talk his way out of this. But then the judge began to read the findings. Every word landed like a stone dropped into water. The evidence was clear, the testimonies were credible, the pattern undeniable. His behavior was ruled reckless, manipulative, and dangerous. Violations of the protective order were documented and confirmed. Witness intimidation was acknowledged. The net I had spent so long weaving had finally closed around him in the eyes of the law. I didn't cheer. I didn't pump my fist or shout. I just exhaled. A long, slow breath I felt I had been holding for years. Beside me, my wife's shoulders shook as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It was real, it was present, and it wasn't born of fear. It was release. The sentence wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no cinematic flourish. Just the steady voice of the judge laying out restrictions, fines, and conditions that stripped him of the power he had once wielded so recklessly. He was ordered to stay away, to pay restitution, to face the consequences of his intimidation. To him, it must have felt like a collapse. To me, it felt like the first time in years that I could stand without looking over my shoulder. Afterward, when the gavel fell and the room began to empty, he turned in his seat and looked at me. For a fleeting second, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Not arrogance, not rage, but recognition. He knew he had lost, and, more importantly, he knew I had survived. Walking out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt different on my skin. Warmer, somehow, softer. Reporters lingered nearby, but I kept my head down, uninterested in feeding the spectacle. This wasn't a story I wanted broadcast as entertainment. This was my life, my scars, my family's healing. Some battles don't need an audience. That evening, we went home. My son was waiting, running to the door with the kind of laughter only a child can summon, pure and unburdened. I crouched down, scooped him into my arms, and held him close. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of fear when I hugged him. I felt only gratitude. Gratitude that he was safe, that I was alive, that the shadow over us had finally lifted. Later, after he was asleep, my wife and I sat on the porch as the sky darkened into night. We didn't talk much. Words weren't needed. The silence between us was no longer heavy with doubt or fear. It was comfortable, like the pause after a long song finally ends. I thought back to the pit, to the smoke, to the footsteps walking away. For so long, that memory had defined me. It had haunted every corner of my life. But sitting there on the porch, with the sound of crickets in the grass and my wife's hand resting in mine, I realized something. That night hadn't ended me. It had reshaped me. It had forced me to find strength I never knew I had. And though the scars would always remain, they no longer felt like chains. They felt like proof. Proof that he had tried to erase me and failed. Revenge, I learned, isn't always about watching someone suffer. True revenge is reclaiming the life they tried to take from you. It's standing in the light with the people you love, laughing again, building again, living again. It's proving, every single day, that their cruelty didn't win. And so, as I closed my eyes that night, the final chapter of this story wasn't about him at all. It was about us. A father, a mother, and a child, finally free to live without fear. A family scarred, yes, but not broken. Stronger now, because we had walked through the fire and come out the other side. The pit had been meant to bury me. Instead, it became the place I was reborn.